Chapter 1. The Locked Door and the Swallowed Ring. It began, as so many strange affairs do, with an early morning summons, one that arrived before I had even finished buttering my toast. The wind howled down Baker Street, rattling the window panes, and sending a sharp chill through our modest sitting-room. Holmes, of course, appeared entirely undisturbed by the weather. He stood at the hearth, pipe in hand, absorbed in a monograph on prehistoric burial practices in Tibet. "Curious," he murmured, "how little difference there is between a ceremonial necklace and a garrote, depending on the context." Before I could ask for clarification, Mrs. Hudson entered with the Morning Post. Tucked among the usual stack of correspondence was a single envelope, cream-coloured and bearing the seal of Scotland Yard. Holmes opened it with the tip of his pipe. "Well, well," he said, scanning the contents. "Lestrade wishes us to attend. A most perplexing affair in Kensington. A locked-room death with a medical twist. It would appear someone has quite literally choked on a secret." I raised an eyebrow. "Another poisoning?" "No, Watson. This one is different." Holmes handed me the note. A man dead in his study, door locked from the inside, the key found in his own coat pocket. Cause of death, suffocation. But what interests Lestrade is what they discovered post-mortem. I read the final line aloud. "A gold ring lodged deep in the deceased's throat, engraved with initials that are not his." Holmes nodded. "Tell me, does that not strike you as deliciously improbable?" "It strikes me as absurd." "Excellent. Then let us see what sort of absurdity London has to offer us this morning." We were in Kensington less than an hour later. The address was a tall, ivy-clad townhouse on Montpellier Walk, its front steps scrubbed to perfection despite the storm. Inspector Lestrade met us at the door, bundled in his greatcoat and looking particularly sour. "Morning, Mr. Holmes." "Doctor, you're just in time. We've only now finished clearing the room." "Have the press caught scent yet?" Holmes asked. "Not yet, thank God," Lestrade muttered. "The family's kept things quiet, though that won't last. The deceased is Mr. Aldous Fenwick, retired solicitor, well known in these parts. Lived alone, save for a maid and a cook. No children, no scandals, until this morning." Lestrade led us inside, down a narrow corridor, panelled in dark wood, and into a modest study. The air was still heavy with the unmistakable scent of cigars, and something else, muskier, metallic. The room was book-lined, neat, and otherwise unremarkable, save for the armchair near the hearth where Fenwick's body had been found, and the shattered teacup near his feet. "The facts are these," Lestrade began briskly. "Fenwick was found by his housemaid at 7:30. Door was locked from the inside, key in his pocket. No windows open. Fire had burned down. His tea untouched." Holmes knelt by the armchair, studying the floor. Position of the body? Seated upright. Slumped slightly, head tilted back, like he fell asleep. "And the cause of death?" Lestrade handed him a slim note. "Initial report from the coroner. Asphyxiation. No ligature marks. No sign of poison. No foreign obstruction, except the ring." Holmes held out his hand, and Lestrade passed him a small evidence pouch. The ring inside was delicate, clearly of high craftsmanship. Gold, with a faintly worn engraving on the inner band, SV too small for a man, Holmes noted. Likely belonged to a woman. Recently cleaned. No blood, no tooth marks. Curious. It was lodged at the top of his esophagus, Lestrade said grimly, almost as if he'd swallowed it deliberately. Holmes stood and glanced toward Whoopshew. Desk. Has anything been disturbed? Not a thing. His journals untouched, letters filed. The only unusual item is the envelope on the writing desk. He pointed toward a small ivory envelope resting near the blotter. Holmes picked it up, examined the seal, then turned it over. It was blank. No name, no mark, and yet not addressed to the deceased. He held it to the light. The ink inside has bled slightly. Someone tried to destroy it. Watson, your knife. I handed him my penknife, and he carefully sliced the envelope open. Inside was a single sheet of paper, partially charred around the edges. A few lines of flowing handwriting remained. Cannot carry this secret any longer. If you will not return it, I must take steps. There was no signature. Holmes read it twice, then folded it carefully and returned it to the envelope. Threat, he murmured, but not in anger, in desperation, and directed toward our victim. Which begs the question, I said, why swallow the ring? Indeed, a dying man might clutch a token. He might attempt to hide it, but to force it down one's own throat, that is an act of panic or devotion. Either way, it was meant to keep the ring from another. Lestrade huffed. Any theories? Holmes turned to him, eyes gleaming. Several, but I shall need to see the rest of the house. Lestrade nodded. The maids in the kitchen, cooks in hysterics, neighbours, report nothing. And there's one more thing. He drew a handkerchief from his coat and unfolded it to reveal a second object, a small rusted key on a broken chain, found in the fireplace ashes. Holmes took it carefully. And so the trail begins, he murmured. A ring swallowed in silence, a key burned to ash, a door locked from within. Watson, I believe we have stumbled upon a puzzle worthy of our time. He turned, his coat sweeping behind him, and motioned toward the stairs. The game, my dear Lestrade, is well and truly afoot. Chapter 2. The Client and the Chain of Secrets. The parlour was dim and sparsely decorated, with heavy curtains drawn against the London grey. Mrs. Annis Plumley, the late Mr. Fenwick's housemaid, sat stiffly on the edge of the settee, wringing her hands over a handkerchief already worn threadbare by her worry. A pot of untouched tea steamed gently on the tray beside her, and her eyes kept drifting toward the hallway, as if half expecting the late master of the house to stride back in and scold her for idle talk. Holmes observed her in silence for a full 30 seconds before taking the chair opposite her. His manner, as always, was calm but unyielding. "You were the one who found the body?" "Yes, sir," she said, voice trembling. "Just after 7. I came up with the morning tray, knocked twice, no answer. I knocked again and, well, I used the spare key, but the door wouldn't budge. It had been locked from the inside." Spare key. Holmes's brow twitched. Yet Lestrade said the key was found in Mr. Fenwick's own coat pocket. She looked startled. "That's right, sir. I mean, there was a second key, but it went missing 2 weeks ago. Mr. Fenwick was furious. Said I must have misplaced it. so he began keeping the only one. Holmes steepled his fingers, which means, until this morning, no one else could have locked or unlocked that door, not without breaking it in. She nodded. That's what makes it so awful. I thought he was asleep. He looked peaceful. But then I saw the tea hadn't been touched. And then the ring, when they said where it was found. Her voice faltered. Holmes spoke gently but precisely. Had you ever seen the ring before? She hesitated. No, sir, but he did have a ring box in his top drawer. Black velvet. I saw it once when dusting months ago. Never said anything. He didn't wear jewellery, not even a watch. What about callers? I asked. Anyone unusual in the days before his death? Her eyes flicked to mine, and then back to Holmes. Yes, a woman came 3 times in the last fortnight, dressed in grey, young, 30 maybe, pale, looked unwell, always came in the evenings, never gave a name. And did Mr. Fenwick speak of her? No, sir, but I saw him pacing after she left. Once I even heard him raise his voice, though I couldn't make out the words. Holmes sat back. Interesting. And was she here yesterday? She nodded slowly. Yes, sir. She arrived just before dusk, left around 9. I remember because she nearly tripped on the front step in the dark, and I had just lit the lamp. Did she return today? No, sir, not that I've seen. Holmes looked thoughtful. Did Fenwick have family? Only a sister, I believe, Miss Lillian Fenwick. Lives up in Hampstead. They hadn't spoken in years, not since the will business. Holmes's eyes lit up slightly. Will business? Master Fenwick changed his will last autumn. Left everything to someone named Miss S.V. That's all it said in the papers I saw. No full name, just the initials. I don't know if he filed it properly, but it was the talk of the kitchen for weeks. Holmes stood. That will be all for now, Mrs. Plumley. You've been very helpful. As we stepped out into the corridor, Lestrade joined us from the hallway, where he'd been interrogating the cook with the persistence of a ferret in a henhouse. She didn't see the lady either, he said, but she remembers something odd. Said Fenwick ordered all the mirrors in the house to be covered a few days ago. Even had the one in the study draped in black cloth. Holmes paused mid-step. All the mirrors? Every last one? Holmes turned to me. Watson, tell me, what does it suggest when a man begins to fear his own reflection? That he's becoming unwell, or that he fears what he sees? Precisely. A guilty conscience, perhaps, or fear of betrayal. Either way, it points to paranoia. Lestrade frowned. Any idea who this Miss S.V. might be? I intend to find out, Holmes replied, reaching for his gloves. But first, we shall visit the solicitor who handled the will. If Fenwick changed his affairs so recently, the records must exist. And if this mysterious woman was truly the heir, well, I imagine she will not remain hidden for long. We departed the house and made for Lincoln's Inn Fields, where Fenwick's affairs had been managed by the firm of Proctor, Staveley and Marsh. The clerk, a nervous young man with ink-stained fingers, ushered us into a cold office and produced the relevant documents. Mr. Fenwick executed this codicil to his will on October 12th, he explained. It revoked all previous provisions and named a sole heir. Name? Holmes asked. Miss Seraphina Vale. Holmes's lips parted slightly. A name I have not heard in some time. I raised an eyebrow. You know her. I knew of her, Holmes said. 10 years ago, Seraphina Vale was a pianist of minor fame and major promise. She vanished from the public eye after a scandal involving a stolen brooch and a withdrawn engagement. No charges were ever filed. He turned to the clerk. Is there a current address? The clerk shuffled papers. No. In fact, we were instructed not to contact her directly. All communication was to go through Mr. Fenwick. Holmes narrowed his eyes. So she reappears after a decade, regains contact with a former acquaintance, and within weeks he rewrites his will in her favour. And dies with her ring in his throat, I added. Holmes rose. Thank you. That will be all. As we stepped out into the street, Holmes stood for a long moment on the pavement, the wind ruffling his collar. She is the key, Watson. Seraphina Vale is the thread from which this tapestry unravels. We must find her. Where do we begin? Holmes turned. We begin where all performers end when they fall from grace. The registry of modest lodgings and pawned jewellery. And, with that, we hailed a cab, the wheels splashing through the London streets, as Holmes leaned forward with purpose in his eyes. Whatever secret Seraphina Vale had carried back into Aldous Fenwick's life, it had been enough to make a man choke. On the truth, literally, and Holmes, as ever, intended to drag that truth into the light. Chapter 3. The first clues, a scene of deception. The morning air had turned sharp by the time Holmes and I reached the East End of London, where streets narrowed and the city forgot itself. Here, theatre boards warped in the damp, and the only music one heard came from cracked windows or distant pianos badly tuned. Holmes moved through the alleys as if born to them, cutting across courtyards and mews with the silent precision of a surgeon preparing his tools. Our destination was a boarding house off Commercial Street, tucked between a tobacconist and a cobbler's stall. A crooked placard read, Mrs. Etheridge's Lodgings. Clean rooms, no questions. Holmes rapped twice on the flaking green door before it creaked open. Mrs. Etheridge herself appeared, a large woman with a face like boiled ham and the eyes of someone who knew far more than she would ever admit. She squinted up at Holmes suspiciously. Not taking in new boarders today. Holmes smiled with polite indifference. I've no interest in lodgings, madam, but I do have interest in a recent tenant, Miss Seraphina Vale. At the name, a flicker crossed her face. What's she done? Nothing at all. I am simply following up on a legal matter concerning an inheritance. Mrs. Etheridge sniffed. She's gone. When? 3 nights ago. Left in a hurry. Paid through the end of the month, though. Did she leave a forwarding address? She did not, she replied, folding her arms. But she left something behind. I was going to send it to the Lost Property Office. May I see it? After a moment's hesitation, she gestured us inside. The hallway smelled faintly of coal smoke and boiled cabbage. From a locked drawer in a small cabinet, she produced a velvet pouch. Inside it lay a brooch, delicate, shaped like a lyre, set with small garnets. On the reverse, faint etching, to S.V. in E-flat. M.F. Holmes examined it under the light. Maurice Forsyth, he murmured. He was the engagement Seraphina walked away from after the scandal, or so the papers said. He turned to Mrs. Etheridge. Did she ever have visitors? Once. A gentleman, heavy-set, moustache, walked with a limp, brought a bouquet, left shouting. And what name did he give? He didn't. But when I asked her later, she just said, that man should have stayed buried. Holmes's brow arched slightly. Buried? Mrs. Etheridge shrugged. She was always saying strange things. Holmes pocketed the brooch and thanked her. Back on the street, I looked to him. Do you suppose she killed Fenwick? I do not believe this is a matter of simple revenge, Holmes replied. There's something else, something theatrical in how this was arranged. The covered mirrors, the ring in the throat, the letter burned at the edges. He paused outside the iron gate of a small chapel, shuttered. This isn't murder born of impulse. It's an act of stagecraft. Someone is controlling the drama. We returned to Kensington later that afternoon. Holmes insisted we revisit the scene of Fenwick's death, this time without Lestrade's presence. The study had been left untouched after the constables completed their initial sweep, though the body had been removed. The first thing Holmes did was close the door. He examined the handle, the lock mechanism, and the inside keyhole. There is only one way this door could have been locked from the inside, he muttered, and that is if the key was turned and then pocketed while still in the room. He then moved to the fireplace, kneeling where the rusted key had been recovered. Watson, he said, pointing, observe the ash pattern. The key wasn't tossed in at random. It was placed carefully beneath the grate, then buried in ash. Intentional, not hasty. I knelt beside him. So someone wanted it found, but not immediately. Or wanted it destroyed, and underestimated the fire's reach. Holmes moved next to the desk, opened the drawer where the letter had been retrieved and pulled it, free once more. He angled it under the light, examining the ink. Faded here, he muttered, tapping a line near the bottom. But not from time, from contact. Moisture, perhaps. And here, the pressure on the pen changes. The hand grew shakier. Written in distress, I offered. More than distress. I suspect the writer knew it might be their last message, when I turned then to the hearthrug. Help me lift this. We pulled back the rug to reveal nothing but bare floorboards. Holmes, however, knocked twice, and one of the boards gave a hollow ring. With his penknife, he pried it up to reveal a shallow compartment. Inside lay a photograph, black and white, a studio portrait of a young Seraphina Vale, seated at a grand piano, her hands mid-gesture, her face serene. On the back, 3 words had been scrawled in pencil. She still sings. Holmes stared at it for a long moment. She was never meant to fade, he said softly. She was meant to rise, and someone dragged her down. Fenwick knew what it was. The ring was not only symbolic, Watson. It was the final act of possession. To swallow it, to keep it from returning to its rightful owner, or perhaps to hide what it meant. But here lies the contradiction. Why would a man hide a ring, and then leave a letter that all but begs for discovery? I frowned. Unless he didn't write it. Holmes's eyes lit. Precisely. He turned to me with sudden urgency. The script is shifting, Watson. We are no longer watching a tragedy. We are watching a rehearsal. One in which our lead actress is still waiting in the wings. And where will we find her? Holmes reached for his coat. where all stories of ruined reputations and buried rings begin. An opera house? Holmes smiled. A graveyard. Chapter 4. The Gathering of Suspect Brompton. Cemetery wore a veil of early evening mist as Holmes and I passed through its wrought-iron gates. The gravel paths were lined with crooked headstones, weather-worn angels, and vaults shrouded in ivy. There was a hush in the air, not silence exactly, but the kind of low murmur one finds only among the dead. It was a fitting stage for the next chapter of the affair. Holmes moved with clear direction, winding past crumbling monuments until we reached a narrow row of family plots towards the eastern boundary wall. He paused before a modest marble headstone, its engraving barely visible through the moss. Maurice Forsyth, 1871, 1896, he heard her sing and never again slept peacefully. Beneath the inscription lay a small, fresh bouquet of wildflowers. Holmes crouched beside it, brushing dew from the petals. "Not from the groundskeeper," he said softly. "These are wild violets, gathered, not purchased. She was here, likely no more than 2 days ago." I stood beside him, hands in my coat pockets. Forsyth was the man she left. The one who gave her the brooch. Holmes nodded. A broken engagement, a missing brooch, and then exile. The society papers whispered of theft, of scandal, but never named names. I wonder, Watson, was the theft ever real, or merely convenient? I glanced again at the epitaph. "He never recovered." "No," Holmes said. "And I suspect he was not the only one." As we turned to leave, Holmes's eyes caught movement. At the edge of the path, a slim figure had appeared among the tombs. Tall, grey-cloaked, moving with a limp, she stopped a short distance away, just beyond a weathered angel statue. Holmes approached without hesitation. "Miss Vale." She turned. It was the woman from the photograph. Time had pressed its fingers gently upon her face, but the eyes were unmistakable, dark, intelligent, and watchful. She did not flinch at the sound of her name. "You're Sherlock Holmes," she said, voice soft and steady. "I am, and this is Dr. Watson." She nodded politely to me, then turned her gaze back to the grave. "You're looking into Aldous Fenwick's death." "We are," Holmes replied, "and into what you meant to him." Seraphina Vale closed her eyes briefly. "I meant everything, and nothing. He was a man who collected broken things. He kept me like a secret, one he could take out when the world seemed dull." "Did you love him?" I asked. She gave a faint, almost amused smile. "I loved who he thought he was. I pitied who he became." Holmes's tone remained even. "You were there the night he died." She turned toward him slowly. "Yes." "Did you kill him?" "No," she said simply. "Then why did you run?" "I didn't run. I left before the storm broke. He was alive when I closed the door behind me." Holmes studied her. "The ring. It was yours." "It was," she said. "He kept it after the scandal. Said it reminded him that even perfection could be stained. And yet it ended up in his throat. I don't know how," she said quietly, "but I never asked for it back. I never asked for anything." "Then why return?" She hesitated. "He wrote to me, said he was changing the will, that he wanted to make peace. Did you believe him?" I wanted to. Holmes stepped closer. He was terrified before he died, covered his mirrors, burned letters, changed locks. He was unravelling. She didn't respond. Holmes tried a different tact. Miss Vale, if you didn't kill him, who did, I think? She said slowly. That he was being blackmailed. That changed the air. Holmes exchanged a glance with me, then turned back. By whom? She shook her head. He wouldn't say. But someone was threatening to expose something from his past, something tied to Maurice. I asked, begged him to tell me. He said only, if they find out what I did, it will destroy us both. And you believed this threat was real? I believe he thought it was. Holmes grew still. Miss Vale, he said, did Fenwick ever mention a name? A person he feared? Only once, she said. He muttered it in his sleep. Holmes leaned in. What name? Lydia. Holmes froze. Are you certain? Yes. Just that one word. Nothing more. Holmes turned to me, eyes gleaming. Watson, he said, we are no longer dealing with a single crime. What do you mean? I mean, he said, that Lydia Forsyth died 5 years ago. Maurice's sister. I blinked. Then how? She died, Holmes said, but her secrets did not. And I believe one of them just surfaced in Aldous, Fenwick's study. We walked Miss Vale to her lodgings on Store Street, a modest room above a dressmaker's shop, and left her with a warning not to leave London. Back in our cab, I turned to Holmes as the wheels clattered beneath us. You think she's innocent? I think she's wounded. And truth, Watson, it's often easier to hide in the company of the wounded. He folded his hands. But now we must find the final players in this performance. For if Lydia Forsyth is dead, someone else is wearing her mask. Chapter 5. First Suspects. The Red Herring. The morning that followed was one of those rare London days when the fog hung low and yellow, coating the city like a film of old varnish. Holmes was already dressed and standing at the window when I descended the stairs, his arms folded behind his back, eyes focused not on the street, but somewhere far beyond it. She said, "Lydia?" he murmured without turning. I nodded, still shaking off sleep. "Lydia Forsyth, dead 5 years, you said." "Precisely. An apparent drowning. The body was recovered and identified by dental record. But now her name emerges in a dying man's dream, days before he is found choked by a ring that was not his. Tell me, Watson, what part of this resembles coincidence?" "None," I said, pouring my tea. "But what puzzles me is motive. Fenwick had no known enemies. If Seraphina Vale was the heir, and not the killer, then who stood to gain from his death?" "Ah," Holmes said, turning now with a gleam in his eye. "But what if his death was not meant to benefit the killer materially, but emotionally? What if it was not an execution, but an act of revenge cloaked in sentiment?" Before I could reply, there was a sharp rap at the door. Mrs. Hudson announced the arrival of Inspector Lestrade, who appeared moments later, hat in hand and cheeks flushed from the cold. "I've news," he said, without preamble. "We've located a suspect, a man seen loitering near Fenwick's house on the night of the murder." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "A man?" "Goes by the name of Callum Dreggs, former porter. dismissed from Fenwick's employ last year. Rumour is he left under a cloud, pilfering wine, arguing with the master. Local constable picked him up after a scuffle in Limehouse. Holmes tilted his head. And what does Mr. Dreggs have to say? Claims he was owed wages. Says he went by the house that night to demand repayment and was turned away. By whom? The maid, Mrs. Plumley. Says she told him Fenwick wasn't taking visitors. Holmes nodded, which tracks with her testimony to us. Did he admit to returning later? Lestrade hesitated. He says no. But we found a handkerchief with his initials near the back gate, embroidered. Far too convenient, Holmes murmured. I thought so, Lestrade agreed. Still, the fellow's temper is well known, and when we searched his flat— You searched his flat? Holmes interrupted. Of course we did. Holmes's eyes narrowed. And what did you find? Lestrade fished something from his coat and placed it on the table. A slender chain, broken at one end. We believe it matches the chain recovered from the fireplace, the one the key was on. Holmes picked it up and examined the links. Then he smiled. A strange, hollow smile. A match in appearance, he said, but not in function. Look here, Watson. This link bears an imperfection, a slight twist in the solder. The chain in the fireplace was uniform. Factory perfect. This is a forgery, or a clumsy substitute. You're saying it was planted? Lestrade muttered. I'm saying it was meant to look like a plant. Someone is very eager for Mr. Dreggs to hang for this. But eager fingers often leave behind inconsistencies. Lestrade scratched his head. Then who would go through the trouble? Holmes stood. That, my dear Lestrade, is the question that leads us to the theatre. The theatre? Yes. Specifically, the Orpheus on Drury Lane. Closed 3 years ago after a financial scandal. Guess who was once its silent backer? Lestrade blinked. Aldous Fenwick? Indeed, he financed their refurbishment, and one of the actresses in that final ill-fated season was Seraphina Vale. I finished. Holmes nodded. But she wasn't the only Vale on that stage. Another name appears in the programme. A supporting actress. Small roles, rarely noticed. Lydia Forsyth. Lestrade paled slightly. But you said she died. She did, Holmes said. But now I wonder, was it Lydia who drowned, or someone else entirely? The room fell silent. Holmes snapped back into motion. Watson, we're due at the British Library. I wish to see a list of all known aliases connected to Lydia Forsyth's stage career. Lestrade crossed his arms. And what about Dreggs? Release him, Holmes said without hesitation. You're sure? He's a drunk, not a murderer, and the murderer is precise, calculated. This— Holmes held up the broken chain. It is the shield. Is a performance, one meant to distract, not conclude. Within the hour, we were at the archives, thumbing through old theatre programmes and casting notices. Holmes worked like a man possessed, scanning columns, cross-referencing names, jotting into his notebook. With surgical clarity, then he stopped. Here, he whispered. Look. I leaned over. A cast list from La Sonnambula, produced in 1896. Ensemble, L. Forsyth. Understudy, Clara Liddell. Holmes pointed to the margin. Clara Liddell. Appears again a year later in Carmen, then vanishes. No records beyond that point. I frowned. You think Clara Liddell is Lydia Forsyth. I think Clara Liddell is the mask, and behind that mask is a woman who wanted revenge for her brother's death, for her family's ruin, for being erased. He closed the book gently, and I think she's about to take her final bow. Chapter 6. The Secret Clue. A Hidden Inconsistency. By midday, the clouds over London had thickened into a grey ceiling, low and restless, as if the sky itself disapproved of the drama unfolding below. Holmes and I returned to Baker Street in near silence, the cab wheels rattling over cobbles slick from a light rain. He said nothing, but I could see the rhythm of thought pulsing behind his eyes, a kind of relentless internal dialogue where every inconsistency was being passed, tested, and filed. Once we were inside, Holmes moved immediately to his desk, where the remnants of the evidence we had gathered so far were laid out in careful symmetry. The chain recovered from Callum Dreggs's room, the burned envelope from Fenwick's desk, the brooch from Seraphina Vale's lodgings, and the photograph of her poised at the piano, inscribed with those haunting words, "She still sings." He stared at them for a long moment. Then he reached for the envelope. "Watson," he said without looking up, "do you recall the exact wording of the letter we recovered from Fenwick's study?" I pulled out my notebook and flipped through the pages. "Cannot carry this secret any longer. If you will not return it, I must take steps." Signed with no initials. Half burned. Holmes tapped his fingers along the desk. It always struck me as odd. "The letter? No, the ink," he replied. The ink had bled. A pale blue smudge in the lower corner, as though exposed to water or tears. And yet nothing else in the drawer was similarly stained. He stood abruptly and retrieved the envelope again, holding it up against the lamp. "See here," he said, gesturing to the lower flap. "A watermark. The letterhead is faint. Royal London Convalescent Home for Women. Do you know it?" "I've passed it in Finchley," I said. "A private institution. Serves as both a sanatorium and long-term residence." Holmes smiled thinly. Precisely the kind of place one might send a disgraced woman with a past to erase. "You think Lydia Forsyth or Clara Liddell was placed there?" "I think she placed herself there, Watson, to disappear, to wait, and perhaps to plan." He fetched his greatcoat and turned toward the door. "Where are we going now?" I asked, reaching for my hat. "To the matron of Royal London, if our mystery woman truly vanished from the stage and society. She left a trail in medical records, not playbills." The reception at the Royal London Convalescent Home was a chilly affair, both in decor and tone. A severe woman with a steel bun and pince-nez received us, her lips thinning when Holmes presented his card. "We do not discuss former patients, Mr. Holmes," she said stiffly. "Confidentiality is paramount." "Would not dream of violating it," Holmes said smoothly. "But I merely seek clarification on a matter of identity. Did a Miss Clara Liddell reside here between 1898 and 1902? The matron frowned. "Clara Liddell, yes, I believe so. She was admitted following a fainting spell at a train station. Nervous exhaustion. We kept her for nearly 3 years. Was she ever visited?" "Only once," the matron said. "A man, thin, bearded, paid in cash, called himself Mr. French. After that, no one. Do you have her file?" She hesitated, then, at Holmes's reassuring nod, disappeared down a corridor. When she returned, she held a thin folder. Holmes examined the pages quickly. She was released in 1902, he said. No forwarding address. But then he stopped. What is it? I asked. He held out the final page. Scrawled in the margin, in the hand of the attending physician, was a note. Patient expresses recurring dreams of drowning and fire. Speaks of burned mouths and the sound of glass. Requires observation. Holmes read it twice. Then he folded the file and handed it back. She was not unwell, he said. She was remembering. We left the home with rain beginning to fall in earnest. Holmes pulled his collar up as we hailed a cab. You think this Clara staged her own madness? I asked as we climbed inside. I think she suffered, but not from delusion, from grief, from guilt, and perhaps from something she witnessed. He looked out the window, eyes narrowed. She knew what Fenwick did, or what he allowed to happen. And now, years later, when she hears he is rewriting his will, giving his fortune not to the Forsyths, but to Seraphina, she returns, not to plead, but to punish. Still, I said, nothing ties her directly to the crime. Holmes nodded, which is why we must return to the study. We arrived once more at Montpellier Walk. Lestrade had posted a constable at the door, but Holmes was granted access without resistance. The study was just as we had left it, though the fireplace had now grown cold, and the air held the stillness of a sealed room. Holmes went straight to the desk. He pulled out the drawer again, empty now, and examined the corners. Then he stopped. He reached behind the back panel and gave a quick tug. A soft click sounded. "Watson," he said, beckoning me closer. I peered into the now gaping back of the drawer. Hidden within a false panel was a folded sheet of paper, brittle and yellowed with age. Holmes unfolded it carefully. It was a legal document, handwritten, unsigned, last will and testament of Maurice Forsyth. Holmes read silently. Then he exhaled. "It's all here," he said. "Maurice intended to leave his estate, not to his family, but to Seraphina Vale. The ring, the brooch, all of it ties back to her. She was the only person he trusted." And Fenwick? Holmes looked grim. He witnessed the will. He filed it, then suppressed it, probably under pressure from Lydia. He kept the ring as leverage, perhaps even guilt. But he never destroyed the document. And when Seraphina reappeared, he tried to make amends. And someone else found out. Holmes replaced the paper. We now know the motive, the inheritance, the betrayal. But we still lack one thing. I met his gaze. The hand that did it. Holmes's eyes were distant. "Again? No," he said softly. "We've already seen the hand. What we haven't yet seen, Watson, is the mirror it belongs to." Chapter 7. The crime grows stranger. The rain had turned the city streets into shallow streams by the time. We stepped back into Baker Street, our coats soaked and our boots tracking grey water across the rug. Yet Holmes paid the weather no mind. He was already halfway across the sitting room, shrugging off his outer garments and pacing in front of the fireplace with the energy of a man on the cusp of revelation. "There is a fracture in this case, Watson," he said, "and it lies not in what we know, but in what Fenwick believed he knew. I poured him a brandy, which he accepted absently. You mean the will? No, Holmes said. Not the one we found hidden. That was Maurice, Forsyth's true testament, never filed, honoured. honoured. But Fenwick's actions suggest he feared someone had discovered it, which leads us to a critical question. Who else knew it existed, or who pretended to? Holmes replied, eyes brightening. Consider this. Fenwick is visited by a woman, Seraphina Vale, who brings back memories of a scandal, a lost engagement, and an inheritance he buried. He rewrites his own will to make amends. But almost immediately he begins to spiral, covering mirrors, locking his study, speaking of secrets, and ultimately swallowing a ring, which was hers. Yes, but why swallow it? Holmes said, now fully animated. What would drive a rational man to that? Not guilt, not affection, no, fear. He moved to his desk and retrieved the photograph once more. She still sings, he murmured. But who said that? And to whom? The fire crackled, casting flickering light over the image of Seraphina at the piano. I sat forward. You're suggesting Fenwick was tricked into believing someone else had returned. Someone. Impossible. Holmes gave a sharp nod. Exactly. Someone led him to believe Lydia Forsyth had come back from the dead. I frowned. But to what end? To drive him to madness, or to confession, or perhaps to suicide disguised as murder. He stepped back to the desk and laid out the pieces again. The chain, the brooch, the letter, the ring. Every element was symbolic, Holmes said. The ring, love lost. The key, access denied. The burned note, truth half revealed. But the mirrors, Watson, they're the key. He turned to me. Why cover them? To hide one's reflection, or to avoid seeing someone else's, Holmes said. What if Fenwick was being visited not just by Seraphina, but by someone who looked like Lydia, who dressed like her, moved like her? A double? A sister? I stared at him. But Lydia's dead. Holmes gave a thin smile. Are we certain? A knock at the door cut through our thoughts. It was Lestrade, dripping wet, with a paper folder under one arm. You were right, he said, stepping inside. We pulled records from the coroner's office. Lydia Forsyth's body was recovered from the Thames in 1899, identified by a locket and a scar on the left forearm. Holmes held out his hand. Let me see the file. Lestrade passed it over. Holmes read quickly, scanning each line until he stopped and tapped the page. Scar described as surgical, precise incision, likely from a childhood operation. He read aloud. And yet in the theatre playbills, Lydia is often listed with roles involving dance. Physical, expressive, not a trace of hesitation. I caught his meaning. A surgical scar might restrict movement, or at least limit her range, Holmes nodded. And if it did, it would appear in every performance review. But there's not a whisper of it, which suggests, Lestrade's eyes widened, that the body pulled from the river wasn't Lydia's. Exactly, Holmes said. The locket was hers, yes, but who was wearing it? Lestrade whistled low. So Lydia faked her death. Or someone else died in her place, Holmes said. And if so, then we must ask, who benefits? He moved back to the fire and stared into the coals. She disappears. Fenwick rises in his career. The Forsyth estate is quietly absorbed into trust accounts under his direction. And years later, When the past begins to stir, he panics, because the person he thought long buried may still walk the earth, and may now be knocking at his door. I stood. Then Lydia may be alive? Or, Holmes said quietly, someone has made Fenwick believe she is. There was a pause. Lestrade glanced between us. What now? Holmes straightened. Now we go to the theatre. The Orpheus? I asked. No, he said, buttoning his coat. The Grand Lyceum. Seraphina Vale has begun performing again under a new name, Sarah Valen. She sings there Tuesdays and Thursdays. If she's returned to the stage, then someone has given her reason to believe the ghosts are gone. He looked to us both. But ghosts, Watson, have a habit of lingering until the curtain falls. The Grand Lyceum stood in the West End like a relic of another century. Its stained glass awning flickered in the rain, its gold-lettered posters plastered with a name we now knew well, Sarah Valen. A voice rekindled. Inside, the foyer was quiet. The show had ended an hour earlier, and only a handful of ushers lingered. We were directed backstage by a young boy in livery, who recognized Holmes instantly and led us past dressing rooms to a modest chamber adorned with roses. Seraphina sat at the vanity, removing earrings. She turned as we entered, eyes narrowing, slightly. You found something, she said. Holmes nodded. I believe someone wanted you to believe the past had been laid to rest. And it hasn't? No, he said softly. It's been waiting. She looked down. I thought I saw her in the crowd a week ago. Holmes moved closer. Where? Front row, second seat from the left. Pale dress, wide-brimmed hat. But when I looked again, she was gone. He stepped back. Then the next question is clear, he said. What is it? I asked. Holmes's gaze was fixed, already turning inward. If Lydia Forsyth is alive, or her memory weaponized, who played her part that night? Chapter 8. Holmes tests a theory. It was just after midnight when we stepped out of the Grand Lyceum into the thick London fog. The gas lamps hissed along the pavement, casting long shadows that danced between carriage wheels and echoing footsteps. Holmes walked briskly, his coat whipping in the wind, his silence deeper than usual. I recognized that look, the drawn mouth, the faraway eyes. He was no longer in the West End. He was on the stage of the crime itself, rehearsing each line and cue. We're missing something, I said as we reached the edge of Covent Garden. If Lydia is alive, or someone made to look like her, why now? Why surface after all these years? Holmes didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was low and certain. Because the final act has begun, Watson, and someone, somewhere, is preparing their bow. We returned to Baker Street. Holmes went straight to the writing desk, laid out the evidence, and began arranging it with surgical precision. Watson, he said, let us test a theory, not for its convenience, but for its contradiction. He placed the photograph of Seraphina beside the burned letter, then the forged will, the ring, and finally the broken chain that had been so conveniently discovered in Callum Dreggs's flat. Consider the following, Holmes said, tapping each item in turn. The chain and the ring were planted, meant to frame Dreggs. But Dreggs had neither the motive nor the cunning to orchestrate such an illusion. which means someone planted them knowing they'd be discovered. The question is, why plant evidence so clumsily unless you want it discredited later? I frowned. To draw attention away from something else? Exactly, Holmes said. To create a suspect so easily unravelled, the real culprit disappears behind the curtain. He pointed to the letter next. This document, half-burned, incomplete. It was placed in the desk, not forgotten. A stage note. But who was the audience? Not us, Watson, not Lestrade. The letter was meant for Seraphina. To draw her back? To test her resolve? To remind her of what she'd lost and of what she might reclaim? But Fenwick wrote it. No, Holmes said firmly. He may have signed it, but the language is wrong. I compared it to his will and legal correspondence. The phrasing is too emotional, too desperate. He stood suddenly. I need to know how far the deception goes, he said, and to do that, I must provoke the author. How? I asked. Holmes's expression grew still. By announcing a discovery I haven't made yet. By morning, the papers carried a curious headline, Sherlock Holmes claims dead woman's hand in Fenwick case. Arrest expected soon. It was a fabrication, of course, placed in the Evening Star by Holmes's acquaintance at the editorial desk. A deliberate provocation. A lit match tossed into the dry woodpile of guilt. We did not have to wait long for the first flicker of flame. Just before noon, a note was slid under our door. No address, no name, written in a hurried, slanted hand. Stop digging. She is gone. Let her stay gone. There are other lives at stake now. Holmes read it once, then held it to the light. No watermark, he murmured. Cheap paper, common ink. But the hand is trembling, not from age, from haste. He turned it over. A smudge, here, in the margin. Chalk, I believe, likely from a slate. A school? I asked. Or a theatre, Holmes replied. Backstage, scene, markers, dressing lists. Places where identity shifts and masks matter more than names. He tapped the corner. We shall return to the Orpheus. The Orpheus Theatre had long been shuttered, its facade flaking, its windows boarded, its grandeur faded like a once great actress reduced to cameo roles in provincial pantomimes. But inside, its skeleton remained intact. Dust-covered pews, broken chandeliers, stage curtains torn like wounded banners. Holmes moved through it like a man walking through memory. In this place, he said softly, Seraphina Vale sang for the last time as herself. And somewhere in this theatre, Lydia Forsyth vanished, or was transformed. We descended to the dressing rooms, rows of broken mirrors and rusted lights. In the second room from the right, Holmes stopped. The mirror was intact. He crouched, then rose holding a slim, leather-bound book. A diary. Its pages had been torn, most removed. But one remained, flattened at the centre. Holmes read aloud, He thinks he saved me, but he saved himself. He buried the truth beneath a signature, and when the curtain fell, I was already gone. He looked up. She wrote this, he said, after Fenwick destroyed Maurice's will, after he denied her the only chance at redemption. I stepped back. So, she killed him. Holmes shook his head. No, I believe she wanted him to live with it, to choke not on a ring, but on the knowledge of what he'd done. but someone else stepped in and turned guilt into punishment. "Who?" Holmes closed the book. "That," he said, "is what I intend to find out tonight." That evening, under cover of dusk, Holmes staged his final test. He arranged for a private recital at the Lyceum, inviting a small crowd under the pretense of a tribute to Maurice Forsyth and his forgotten compositions. Seraphina would sing. The audience would include all the remaining suspects: Deirdre Vale, Seraphina's cousin, Mrs. Annis Plumley, the maid, and, most curiously, a woman claiming to be Lydia's former governess, now suddenly reappeared from France. Holmes took the box seat above, arms folded, gaze sweeping the room. "She's here," he whispered to me as the music began. "And she still sings." Below us, Seraphina took the stage in a pale gown, her voice rising into the rafters. Holmes watched the crowd, and in the third row, second seat from the left, a woman stood and walked out as the music swelled, wide-brimmed hat, pale gloves. "Fled again?" I said. "No," Holmes said, rising. This time she gave herself away. He turned to me with eyes full of certainty. "I have her now, Watson. Not the ghost, not the grief." He paused. "But the actress who knew how to bring them both back to life?" Chapter 9. A second attempt. The culprit strikes again. The sound of Seraphina's final note lingered in the air like the last breath of a dying candle, and the crowd burst into applause. But Holmes was already gone. I followed quickly through the velvet-curtained corridor that led to the private boxes. But by the time I reached the foot of the stairs, Holmes was rounding the far corner of the lower level, his coat a blur of black against the dim hall. He had seen something in that theatre, something that confirmed what he had suspected since the moment that veiled figure left her seat mid-performance. He did not pause to explain. We exited through the side-stage door into a narrow alley behind the Grand Lyceum. The rain had returned softer now, falling in steady rhythm as Holmes pressed forward, eyes scanning every doorway and shadow. "She knew I was watching," he said breathlessly. "That's why she left. But she forgot something, Watson. Something every performer forgets. What's that? That an exit, no matter how dramatic, still requires a door." He halted suddenly, just beyond the reach of the gaslight, and raised a hand. Ahead of us, a tall figure in a wide-brimmed hat turned down a side street and vanished behind a carriage. Holmes broke into a run. I gave chase, boots pounding wet cobblestones, coat heavy with mist. We rounded the corner to see her silhouette, slipping into the entryway of a boarding house, shabby, with a broken sign above the lintel reading "Hobson's Rooms, Ladies Preferred." Holmes didn't hesitate. He knocked. The door opened a crack. A woman peered out, young, freckled, suspicious. "She's gone upstairs," Holmes said firmly. "We're not here to cause trouble, but someone's life is in danger." The woman blinked. Then, seeing something in Holmes's gaze that few people could refuse, she stepped aside and let us in. We took the stairs 2 at a time. On the 3rd floor, Holmes paused before a door with flaking paint and knocked once, sharply. No answer. He knocked again. "Miss Liddell, or Lydia, if you prefer. This is over. Do not force me to enter by less graceful means." Still nothing. Holmes tried the handle. unlocked. He pushed the door open slowly. Inside was a small room lit by a single oil lamp. The smell of damp wallpaper and lavender hung in the air. A hat lay on the table. Gloves, recently removed, and in the corner, an open window letting in the rain. But the room was empty, or so we thought. Then Holmes crossed to the wardrobe and opened it in one smooth motion. The woman inside flinched, startled. It was her, not quite Lydia Forsyth, but the closest anyone could have made her. The same high cheekbones, the same dark hair pinned in the same way Seraphina remembered, but older now, harder around the eyes, and beneath that veneer of elegance, a tremor, not of fear, but of fury barely restrained. "You're clever," she said softly, stepping out of the wardrobe. "You always were, Mr. Holmes." Holmes didn't smile. "You played the part well, Miss Colette Vale," she finished for him. "Seraphina's cousin. Poor overlooked Colette, the understudy in life as well as on stage." I stared. "Then you were the one in the audience last week, the one who sent the letter. You impersonated Lydia." She gave a bitter smile. "Impersonated? I became her. I knew her mannerisms, her voice. I'd studied her for years. I knew it would break him." Holmes's tone was even. "So you visited Fenwick, made him believe the past had risen, and when that wasn't enough, you made sure he died with her name on his lips. Colette didn't flinch. He deserved it. He buried my uncle's will. He let Maurice die in disgrace, let Lydia fade into scandal, let Seraphina vanish. And for what? A quiet life, a name on a brass plaque." "You planted the ring," Holmes said, "forced it down his throat, made it look like guilt consumed him." Colette tilted her head. "Not forced. He swallowed it himself." I blinked. "What?" She turned to me. "You don't know what fear does to a man, Doctor. When I walked into that room, dressed in Lydia's old coat, wearing her perfume, her voice trembling with revelation, he looked at me as if death had come in person. And I said nothing. I let him tremble. I laid the ring on the table, and he picked it up, stared at it for a long time, then swallowed." "You watched him die?" I asked. "I watched him choke on what he had buried. I didn't touch him. I didn't have to." Holmes stepped closer. "But you did more. You forged a letter. You burned the edges. You planted false evidence in Callum Dreggs's flat. You staged everything like a performance, because it was," she said fiercely, "and I was finally the one in the leading role." A silence fell. Then Holmes said, "And now the final curtain." But Colette stepped back. "Not yet," she said, and in a flash her hand went to the drawer of the bedside table. Holmes was faster. With a quick movement, he knocked the drawer shut and gripped her wrist with one hand. "No dramatics," he said coldly. "There's enough tragedy in this story already." She didn't resist. By the time Lestrade arrived 20 minutes later, Colette sat quietly in the corner chair, hands folded, face serene, as though she had just finished the last act of a long play and awaited the critics. She confessed calmly. Everything, just as Holmes had theorized. When Lestrade led her away, she paused at the threshold. "Tell her I did it for her," she said. "Tell Seraphina the past has been avenged." Then she was gone. Back at Baker Street, Holmes poured us both a drink and sat by the fire. The evidence once scattered across his desk, now locked away. "She was right about one thing," he said finally. "What's that?" "That revenge," Holmes murmured, "is the purest form of theatre. But the audience always suffers the most." I looked into the fire, watching the flames twist like dancers on a final stage. And somewhere far from Baker Street, I imagined Seraphina Vale opening a letter, reading a name she never expected to see again, and closing the book on a performance she had never auditioned for, but could now, at last, walk away from. Chapter 10. The true motive begins to surface. It was an unusually quiet morning on Baker Street. The mist had lifted, revealing a pale winter sun, and the ever-present hum of the city seemed muted, as if London itself was taking a breath between tragedies. Holmes sat in his usual armchair, long fingers steepled beneath his chin, a half-finished pipe resting in the ashtray beside him. I was across from him, nursing a cup of coffee and reviewing my notes. For all intents and purposes, the case of Aldous Fenwick's death had been resolved, and yet Holmes had not filed it away. "Not yet," she confessed, I said at last. "She orchestrated the deception, staged the emotional collapse, and used the imagery of Lydia Forsyth to drive Fenwick into that final, fatal act. What remains?" Holmes didn't move. "Something doesn't fit." I set my cup down. "What?" "Her motive," he said quietly. "Revenge, yes, but not purely for herself. She said she did it for Seraphina. Out of loyalty. Out of love. And yet Seraphina herself never asked for it, never hinted at it, never wanted it." He turned his gaze toward the fire, which means the motive was not revenge, not truly. It was substitution. I blinked. Substitution! Holmes rose and began to pace, slow and deliberate. Colette Vale lived her life in the shadow of a cousin celebrated for beauty, talent, tragedy. She was always second, never chosen, never heard. And then Seraphina vanishes from public life. Scandal consumes her. Fenwick moves on, and in that silence, Colette sees her chance. "She stepped in to finish the story," I murmured. "Not just finish it," Holmes said. "To become it." He moved to the desk, opened a drawer, and removed 2 photographs. One of Seraphina in her youth, the other of Colette Vale from a newspaper clipping Lestrade had recovered after the arrest. He placed them side by side. "Look," he said, hair darkened, chin tilted to match the angle, posture rehearsed. "She was mimicking her cousin," I said. "Not mimicking," Holmes corrected. "Replacing. The Lydia illusion was the catalyst, but the true role Colette wished to assume was Seraphina's." "But why? What would she gain?" Holmes tapped the photograph. "Legacy. Recognition. If Fenwick had died leaving his fortune to Seraphina, and Seraphina disappeared, perhaps tragically, it would be Colette who could step in, claim the inheritance, claim the sorrow, even claim the voice." "She sang?" Holmes nodded. "Not as well, not as powerfully, but enough. Enough to hold a note. Enough to fool a grieving lawyer, a distant trustee." He handed me a folded piece of parchment, one we had not reviewed before. "I found this in Fenwick's safe beneath a false bottom. It was filed but never sent." I unfolded it. It was a handwritten letter, addressed to the legal offices of Proctor, Staveley and Marsh. to whom it may concern, I request a delay in the final processing of my revised testament. There has arisen a concern that the woman now visiting me may not be Miss Seraphina Vale, as she claims. I ask that no funds be released until I have confirmed her identity through Miss Lydia Forsyth, if she can be found. Aldous Fenwick. My stomach turned. He suspected. He realized something was wrong. Holmes nodded, which makes his death all the more pressing. It was not only staged for guilt, it was timed. Had he lived one more week, he would have named Colette as an impostor. He retrieved a final document, a receipt for a railway ticket, dated 2 days before his death. Holmes said, "Destination, Whitstable, Kent." Why there? Because that is where Lydia Forsyth's grave lies. He was going to see for himself. I understood then. He wasn't running from guilt. He was chasing the truth. And Seraphina? I asked quietly. Where does she fall in all this? Holmes sighed. She was the unknowing centerpiece. The tragedy around which others built their own narratives. She didn't want revenge. She wanted peace. And because of that, she was the perfect figure for Colette's theatre. We sat in silence for some time. Eventually, Holmes stood and crossed to the window, looking down at the street. I once said, Watson, that the stage is a mirror to life, but in this case it was the other way around. Life became a mirror, distorted, refracted, everyone performing the version of themselves they thought others expected. He turned back to me. But mirrors don't show you who you are, only what you appear to be. A light knock came at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered with a telegram. Holmes took it, opened it, and read silently, then handed it to me. Colette Vale transported to Holloway Prison this morning. No resistance, no appeals, no visitors expected. Lestrade Holmes returned to his chair and picked up his pipe again. I watched him in the firelight, the pieces finally falling into place. And I realized that this case, more than any before, had left something behind in Holmes. Not a burden, not guilt, but weariness, the kind that comes not from exertion, but from peering too long into reflections that never quite look back the way one expects. She still sings, I said aloud, echoing the inscription. Holmes glanced up. No, he said after a pause. She never stopped. It's the rest of us who finally began to listen. Chapter 11. The Bait. Holmes's Grand Strategy. Holmes has often told me that in the great game of deduction, truth is rarely captured by force. It must be lured, like a wary animal, into the open. And so, 2 days after Colette Vale's quiet confinement in Holloway Prison, Holmes began the second stage of his investigation. Not to solve the murder, for the facts were largely in hand, but to unravel the deeper thread. The identity Colette had stolen and the possible hand behind it. I do not believe she acted entirely alone, he said as we walked along the south bank of the Thames one crisp morning. There is an elegance to the deception that does not align with her personality. She was brilliant, yes, but volatile. The timing, the forgeries, the placement of the ring, too orchestrated for a woman whose hatred was so personal. Said she did it for Seraphina, I reminded him. She said that, Holmes replied, but her actions served herself, and someone, somewhere, fed that delusion with remarkable precision. We arrived at a modest row house in Pimlico. Holmes had arranged for a meeting here under false pretenses. The occupant, a Mr. Everett Dunn, was the late Aldous Fenwick's former legal clerk, dismissed a year prior for personal indiscretions, according to the brief notice in the firm's internal register. Dunn was the intermediary, Holmes had said earlier that morning. Too minor to attract suspicion, too useful to ignore. Fenwick trusted him once. That was a mistake. Holmes knocked. The door opened a fraction, revealing a pale, balding man with thinning spectacles and a twitch in his left eye. "Yes?" Holmes smiled. "Mr. Dunn, my name is Phelps. I'm acting on behalf of the estate of Seraphina Vale. We're seeking legal verification of an unsigned will discovered after Mr. Fenwick's unfortunate death. I understand you had prior involvement in the handling of his records." Dunn's expression froze, then flickered into something Holmes must have expected. Guarded interest. "I don't know anything about that," Dunn said quickly. "I was dismissed nearly a year ago." Holmes remained patient. "But you were present when the revisions to Mr. Fenwick's will were made. You may recall a codicil involving Miss Vale. A sealed document. I wasn't involved." Holmes reached into his coat and withdrew a folded envelope. Dunn's eyes locked on it. His fingers twitched. "I believe this may belong to you," Holmes said. He didn't hand it over. Instead, he waited. Dunn's eyes flicked down the hall, then back to the envelope. "And then he ran. We gave chase, thundering down the street as Dunn barreled around a corner and vanished into an alley flanked by tall brick walls and rubbish bins." Holmes was faster than I'd expected, leaping over a crate and cutting across Dunn's path like a shadow. Within moments, he had him cornered against the stone wall. "No dramatics," Holmes said calmly. "There are only two outcomes here, Mr. Dunn. One ends with questions, the other with prison." Dunn sagged. "I never touched him," he gasped. "I didn't kill Fenwick. I didn't." "No," Holmes agreed. "But you helped someone who did." In the hours that followed back at Baker Street, Dunn told us everything. He had been approached a year ago by a woman who introduced herself only as Miss Wren. She claimed to be a private agent seeking restitution for Seraphina Vale. She knew details about Fenwick's financial dealings, intimate details Dunn himself had been privy to during his tenure at the firm. She offered money, a great deal of it. His task? Retrieve the unsigned will of Maurice Forsyth, hidden away in an old lockbox at Proctor, Staveley and Marsh, and deliver it to her. He did. He also forged 2 false codicils on Fenwick's personal stationery. Letters designed to sow doubt, encourage fear, and position Seraphina's return as not just inevitable, but incriminating. "And did you ever see Miss Wren again?" Holmes asked. Dunn hesitated. "Once, a week before Fenwick's death. She was at the opera, with Seraphina Vale." That gave Holmes pause. "Describe her. Tall, veiled, gloved hands. But the voice, cultured, measured, nothing like Colette's." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "You're certain?" "Yes. I'd met Colette Vale once at a firm function. Miss Wren was not her." After Dunn had been handed off to Lestrade, who was both delighted and mildly irritated at having to open a second ledger of charges, Holmes returned to the window and stared out at the street below. His brow furrowed. "There is another player," he said finally. "One not yet revealed." "You think this Miss Wren orchestrated everything?" "No," Holmes said, but she refined it, took Colette's resentment and shaped it into a performance. And Seraphina? Holmes turned to me. That is the final question. Was Seraphina Vale merely a pawn in this game, or its queen? That evening, under the soft hum of gaslight and the aroma of toast and tobacco, Holmes drafted a letter. It was addressed to Seraphina Vale, but not sent. Instead, he placed it in an envelope marked private and handed it to me. "You'll deliver this tomorrow," he said, "directly into her hands, no intermediaries." I turned the envelope over. What does it say? He met my gaze. It says that I know the truth. The next morning, I found Seraphina in her modest room above the dressmaker's shop on Store Street, just as she had described it. She accepted the letter without a word, sat at her desk, broke the seal. Her hands didn't tremble, but her eyes did not lift from the page for nearly 3 minutes. When she finally folded the paper and placed it back into the envelope, she turned to me with a soft, sad smile. "Tell Mr. Holmes," she said, "that he is right about almost everything." And then, perhaps for the first time since the case began, she laughed, just once, light and quiet, like a final note hanging in the air of an empty concert hall. Chapter 12. The Moment of Recognition. When I returned to Baker Street, the fog had begun to roll in thick across the rooftops, turning the lamplight into pale golden halos. I found Holmes at the fireplace, unmoving, one hand draped loosely over the arm of his chair, while the other rested atop a closed volume of Thucydides. He did not rise as I entered, but his eyes flicked toward me with a question. "She read it," I said, "every word. And when she was done, she smiled, not with triumph, but with understanding." Holmes gave a small nod, as though this, too, he had anticipated. "And did she say anything else?" I hesitated. "She said you were right about almost everything." That brought the faintest glimmer of amusement to his features. "Almost," he repeated, "an irritating word in most contexts, but today I will permit it." I sat across from him. "Then you believe she was complicit?" "I believe," Holmes said, "that Seraphina Vale was neither villain nor victim. She was the ghost in the wings, the silent refrain played too often to be ignored. Colette may have lit the fire, but Seraphina showed her where to strike the match. You think she intended for Fenwick to die? I think she intended for truth to surface. Whether Fenwick would survive it was a matter left to fate, or perhaps to guilt." He reached for the envelope I had returned with and tapped it twice. "In that letter I posed no accusation. I merely asked a question. Why did you wait until after his death to reclaim your name?" "And she didn't deny it?" "No," Holmes said, "because denial would be wasted breath." He rose and moved to the desk, where a single item now sat apart from the rest, the ring, once swallowed, once hidden, now gleaming, harmless in the open. Holmes picked it up delicately. "This ring was never meant to kill," he murmured. "It was meant to confess. Fenwick saw it as the key to a locked past. But Seraphina, she saw it as a memory returned." I frowned. But why go to such lengths? Why orchestrate such layered deceit when she could have come forward openly? Holmes turned to me with something almost like sympathy in his eyes. "Because when the truth is buried for too long, Watson, It ceases to be truth. It becomes a story. And Seraphina knew that no one believes stories without spectacle. He placed the ring back on the velvet tray. She needed more than justice. She needed an audience. Later that evening, we received a visitor. To my surprise, it was Miss Hartley, the former governess of the Forsyth household, now older, more severe, but with the unmistakable carriage of someone who had seen too much and said too little. Holmes greeted her with a calm nod. "Miss Hartley, I was expecting someone." "But not me," she replied. He gestured to the seat beside the fire. "You were Lydia's companion once, her chaperone, her keeper, and eventually her mourner. Yet you vanished after the scandal." Miss Hartley gave a thin smile. "Because I was paid to. Aldous Fenwick arranged for my departure, under the condition that I would never speak of the will, or Lydia's final letter." "Letter?" Holmes asked. She reached into her coat and drew out a brittle envelope, faded and sealed in wax so old it cracked as she handed it over. "She wrote it the night before she went to the Thames," Miss Hartley said, "or was sent to the Thames. I kept it all these years. I don't know why. Maybe because I knew one day someone like you would come asking." Holmes opened the letter carefully. It was short. "To whom it may concern. If this reaches you, then the lie has ended. Maurice never betrayed us. Aldous did. I am not afraid to vanish, but I want the music to remain. Seraphina must be remembered, not me." LF, he folded it silently. "That handwriting," he said, "matches the letter found burned in Fenwick's desk." Miss Hartley nodded. "She tried to reach him one last time, to give him a chance to undo it. But he never replied, not with words," she said, "only with silence, and later with money." Holmes stepped back. Then Lydia's final act was not suicide. It was silencing. But the echo never stopped ringing, I finished. That night, Holmes did not play the violin. Nor did he retreat into his usual post-case melancholy. Instead, he sat by the fire well past midnight, reading Lydia's letter once more, then setting it beside the brooch, the ring, and the torn concert programme from the Orpheus Theatre. I watched him from across the room, the amber glow casting long shadows against the walls, and realised something that had been forming in my thoughts for days now. This was never a mystery about who committed a crime. It was a mystery about what survives after the crime has been forgotten. Legacy, memory, music and grief that learns to wear another face. Holmes finally stood, stretched and extinguished the lamp. "Tomorrow," he said, "we speak to Seraphina one last time, not as a suspect, but as the final witness to a play that ran far too long." Chapter 13. The Final Attempt to Escape. It was just past 10 the following morning when we arrived once more at Store Street. The pale brick buildings washed in a chill drizzle, and the street unusually quiet. Holmes did not speak as we climbed the stairs to Seraphina Vale's lodgings above the dressmaker's shop. His hands were clasped tightly behind his back, his steps measured. There was no longer a puzzle in need of solving, only a truth in need of confronting. He knocked gently. There was no answer. He knocked again, louder this time. Still silence. Holmes gave me a glance, then produced a slender metal tool from his coat. In moments the latch gave way. We stepped into the flat. The room was empty. No signs of struggle, no signs of departure either. The bed was made, the small breakfast table still set for one. A single candle had been burned down to its wick the night before. On the writing desk, an envelope lay waiting. My name was written on the front. He opened it cautiously. Dr. Watson, if you are reading this, then you have come too late to find me, but soon enough to understand. I am not running, not in the way Colette did. I am simply stepping off the stage. Let the world remember the music, not the scars. Holmes already knows everything, I suspect. He always does. But I could not stay to confirm it. Tell him thank you, and goodbye. S.V. I looked up. Holmes stood at the window, unmoving, watching the street below. She's gone, I said. He didn't turn. She planned it well. Likely slipped out through the alley entrance as we approached. She would have booked her passage by post, somewhere quiet, coastal. Do you think she'll disappear entirely? He turned to me now, eyes distant but clear. No, she'll vanish long enough to heal. Then, perhaps, she will sing again. But not as Seraphina Vale. That name has become too heavy with ghosts. He crossed to the desk and picked up a small object resting beside the letter. A brooch. Not the lyre-shaped one we had seen earlier, but a new one. A tiny golden bird in mid-flight. Holmes held it in his hand and nodded slowly. A parting symbol. To say she's free, I asked. He looked up at me. No, to say that she chooses what remains. Just then, a knock sounded from downstairs. Heavy, rushed. Moments later, Lestrade burst into the room. We've got a problem, he said without preamble. Colette Vale, she's gone. What? I asked. Holloway reported her missing an hour ago. Cell door opened in the early morning. No signs of forced entry. Holmes's expression sharpened, but not in shock. She had help. Possibly from the inside, Lestrade muttered, but there's more. The warden received a note this morning. Anonymous. It said only one thing. He pulled a scrap of paper from his coat and handed it to Holmes. I leaned in to read. The understudy never misses her cue. Holmes folded the note slowly. She knew Seraphina would vanish. Lestrade's brow furrowed. You think she's going after her? Holmes shook his head. Not to harm her. Colette doesn't need to. She's already rewritten the script. In the public eye, Seraphina Vale was connected to a murder, then disappeared mysteriously. In Colette's mind, that is the climax. Now she enters as the one left behind, the tragic cousin, the survivor. Then what do we do? Holmes looked out the window again. Nothing, he said quietly. Not yet. Lestrade looked stunned. Nothing? She'll surface, Holmes said. Somewhere respectable, with a new patron, a piano recital, a sympathetic audience. And when she does, then we will remind the world of what truly happened. Lestrade grunted. I don't like it. Holmes smiled faintly. Neither does she, but this is no longer a game of law. It's a game of legacy. After Lestrade departed, Holmes remained at the window for a long time, watching the people below move like figures on a stage. I sat beside the writing desk, the brooch still in my hand, and thought about the two women who had shaped this entire affair, one in silence, the other in performance. What now? I asked finally. Holmes spoke without turning. "Now we wait for the next performance. From Colette?" "No," he said softly. "From the truth." And in that moment I saw it, the rare expression that crossed Holmes's face only in the most elusive of cases. Not satisfaction, not triumph, but the faintest trace of sorrow, as if he had solved not a crime, but an elegy. Chapter 14. Holmes closes in, the final clue revealed. The final clue did not arrive in the form of a confession, nor a body, nor even a telegram hastily scrawled from some remote port town. It arrived in the post, a thick envelope sealed with dark red wax, delivered on a Thursday morning so fog-drenched that the street lamps flickered like distant stars. Holmes opened it without ceremony. We had been expecting something. What we were not expecting was what lay within. He drew out 3 items. The first, a newspaper clipping from a French-language periodical, Le Matin, dated only 3 days prior. The headline, roughly translated, read, "Mysterious British singer, debuts in Bordeaux, audience stirred by familiar voice." The photograph beneath it showed a stage, hazy and distant, but the profile in the spotlight was unmistakably hers, Serafina, or someone using that name. The second item was a concert program. Handwritten on the inside cover were 3 words, "She still sings." And the third, a train ticket. One way, London to Bordeaux. Departure. That very evening. Holmes stared at it for a long moment. "She's inviting you," I said. He nodded. "Or challenging me." "She wants the final act on her terms." "No," Holmes replied softly. "She wants the curtain to fall before I can reach her." He turned to the fire and held the ticket over the flame for a moment, then stopped, pulling it back just as the edge began to curl. "I won't go," he said. I was stunned. "What?" "She's already made her choice, Watson. If I chase her, she becomes a myth, a hunted name. If I stay, she becomes memory." He turned and placed the half-singed ticket on the desk beside the brooch. "But Colette," I said, "is still out there." "Yes, and she's the one we will catch." He retrieved another envelope, this one smaller, unsealed, and addressed in Holmes's own hand. "To whom is that?" I asked. "To Lady Ashcroft," he said, slipping in a second copy of the Loch, mating clipping. "She is among the trustees of the Forsyth estate. It is time the legal fiction of Serafina's reappearance be preserved only as a performance. Meaning the money will remain untouched. Neither Colette nor any pretender will claim it. The estate shall be placed into perpetual trust for public good, perhaps an institute for music and rehabilitation." He smiled faintly. "Let them inherit silence." Just then, Mrs. Hudson appeared with a visitor's card. Holmes read it, and his brow arched. "Miss Clara Plumley," he said aloud. "The maid?" I asked. Holmes nodded. "Formerly of Fenwick's household. She was ushered in moments later. A quiet woman in her 30s, modestly dressed, with eyes that had clearly seen more than they'd ever voiced. She sat delicately, hat in hand. "I know I'm not supposed to be here," she said at once, "but I think I may have something you ought to see." She withdrew a folded piece of paper from her bag, aged, creased at the corners, sealed in an envelope bearing Fenwick's monogram. "I was cleaning the back hall the week before the master died," she explained. "I found this slipped behind the umbrella stand. I think he meant to send it, or perhaps hide it." Holmes opened it carefully. I stood behind him and read over his shoulder. My dear Miss Vale, I am haunted, not by ghosts but by omissions. I buried your uncle's testament not for gain, but for fear. Fear of what it would say about me, what it would unearth about us. I should have stood by you, but I chose reputation over justice. I see now what that has cost you. I do not deserve your forgiveness, but I beg it anyway. Should this letter never reach you, it is because I lacked the courage to see it delivered. Aldous. The silence in the room became almost reverent. Holmes folded the letter, returned it to its envelope and handed it back to Clara. Thank you, Miss Plumley. You have done more than any of us by preserving this. She nodded, eyes misty. I only wanted someone to know he wasn't all bad. Holmes waited until she had gone before speaking again. Redemption, Watson, he said quietly, is the final mystery. Most people never find it, but some leave just enough behind for it to grow. That evening we sat by the fire once more, the rain returning to tap at the windows like a ticking metronome. So what happens now? I asked. Holmes reached for the brooch again, weighing it in his hand. We allow the curtain to fall naturally. Colette will reappear eventually, with a name slightly altered, a new benefactor, a minor scandal. But when she does, we'll be waiting. He smiled, sharp, quiet, certain. And Seraphina? He looked toward the shadows cast by the lamplight. She's already gone, Watson. All that remains now is the song. And somewhere, in a theatre, far from London, I imagine that voice rising once more, clear, sorrowful, and strangely triumphant. Chapter 15. The Final Gathering. The final act was not announced. It did not arrive with a thunderclap or a dramatic telegram, nor with the sudden appearance of a long-lost suspect at the door. Instead, it came quietly, as so many endings do, wrapped in mundane conversation over morning tea and toast. Holmes was rereading a slim volume of Goethe when the letter arrived. This time it bore no wax seal, no dramatic embellishment, only a neat script and a return address from the south coast of England. He read it in silence, folded it once, and placed it on the table. Colette Vale, he said. I looked up from my paper. She's surfaced. She's invited us, he replied, to Brighton, 2 days hence. I blinked. Invited? Holmes nodded. To a private gathering. Her words, the performance has ended. The critics may now enter the theatre. You believe it? He allowed himself a faint smile. I believe she wants to be heard one last time, on her terms. We arrived in Brighton on a morning softened by sea breeze and low grey skies. The house stood apart from the bustle of the promenade, tucked behind hedgerows, whitewashed and narrow, its windows shuttered against the world. A maid, no more than 17, opened the door and led us wordlessly to a drawing-room where a fire crackled despite the mild spring air. Colette Vale stood at the window, dressed in dove-grey silk, her back straight and expression unreadable. She turned only when the maid had left. I wondered if you'd come, she said. You invited us, Holmes replied evenly. I did, she said, walking to a small writing desk where a tea service had been laid. Because I owe you both. The end of the story. She gestured for us to sit. Holmes declined. I accepted. I'm not here to plead innocence, she said. I know the theatre I constructed, every trap, every tear, but what you don't understand is that I did it for peace. Peace for whom? Holmes asked quietly. For all of them, she said, voice tightening. For Serafina, who deserved to be remembered as more than a scandal. For Maurice, whose name was erased. For Lydia, who lived her life in a shadow and died with the truth still buried. She paused. And yes, for myself. Because sometimes when the world refuses to give you a part, you must write your own. Holmes regarded her for a long time. You did not kill Aldous Fenwick. You created the circumstances for his guilt to do the job. She nodded. I never laid a hand on him, but I visited as Lydia. I let him see what he feared most. He swallowed, the ring not out of hatred, but out of dread. He knew it all would come to light. You used the theatre, I said, as your weapon. I used what I knew, she replied. Stagecraft, costume, timing, emotional manipulation. You fight with the tools life gives you. Holmes stepped closer. And what now? She looked out the window again. Now, I disappear. I've left a confession with my solicitor. It will be sent to Scotland Yard if I do not return from the continent by the end of next month. I'm not foolish enough to think I can outrun this forever, but I'm asking for time. To do what? I asked. She turned back to us. To let the world forget the scandal before it forgets the music. I'm giving Serafina's story an ending. Holmes studied her. You've already written it, haven't you? She smiled faintly. A new composition. Debuting under her name. Only one performance. After that, the score will be retired. Silence fell. And for the first time since our arrival, Holmes nodded, not with approval, but with recognition. You're not seeking redemption, he said. No, she replied. I'm offering a requiem. We left Brighton that evening, neither of us, speaking much on the train ride back. Holmes sat with his head tilted toward the window. The passing fields reflected dimly in the glass, his fingers lightly drumming against the edge of his cane. She will vanish, he said at last, but not as a fugitive, as a ghost. And do you think, I asked, that justice has been served? Holmes considered this. Not in the courts, not in any conventional sense. But the truth was exhumed, the lies dismantled, the dead named and the living heard, turned to me. And sometimes, Watson, that is all justice can be. 3 weeks later, a single review appeared in the arts section of Le Monde. Under the name Serafina Vale, a woman performed only once on the Bordeaux stage. Her voice was haunting, not in flaw, but in feeling. It was as though the aria was being sung from beneath water. When it ended, the hall did not applaud. They simply sat in silence. There was no encore. No further performances, and no trace of Colette Vale thereafter. But on quiet evenings, Holmes would sometimes take down the brooch from his shelf, turn it over in his hands, and say, almost to himself, "She still sings." Chapter 16. The Reveal. Holmes breaks down. The crime several days passed before Holmes consented to speak of the case in full. We had returned to the familiar fog of Baker Street. where the sounds of London's carriages and foot traffic formed a quiet symphony outside our windows. And still, Holmes said nothing, until the arrival of Inspector Lestrade. The inspector had brought with him a fresh report. Colette Vale had not been seen in any port town. No aliases had been flagged across travel registries, and her solicitor claimed ignorance about her present location. "She's vanished," Lestrade said, more irritated than surprised, just like the other one. Holmes smiled without humour. Colette Vale wanted nothing more than to vanish into a story, and now she has. Lestrade looked at me, then back at Holmes. "So is that it then? Case closed?" Holmes shook his head. The case, Lestrade, was never just about the death of Aldous Fenwick. It was about a sequence of masks, each worn with precision. "Shall I walk you through it?" Lestrade groaned and sat back. "Go on then. I've got my notebook." Holmes stood, folded his hands behind his back, and began to pace slowly across the rug. "Let us begin with the facts," he said. "Aldous Fenwick, a man of wealth and discretion, dies in a locked room with a ring lodged in his throat. A ring bearing the initials of Seraphina Vale, an heiress of faded renown and buried scandal. At first glance, it appears to be suicide, driven by guilt or obsession. But several elements complicate this." He raised a finger. "First, the ring itself. It was discovered in pristine condition, untarnished, polished, and placed precisely where it would be discovered. This is not the behaviour of a man panicking or despairing. It is the action of someone performing an act for an audience." He paused. "Second, the letter, partially burned, incomplete, unsigned. It appears to be a confession or a plea. But the ink, handwriting, and paper revealed inconsistencies. It was a forgery, planted. The illusion of remorse, meant to mislead, turned to Lestrade. The moment I read that letter, I suspected we were not dealing with a spontaneous crime. This was theatre, Inspector, and someone had written a brilliant script." He gestured toward the mantel, where the brooch now rested beneath a glass dome. "Enter Colette Vale, cousin to Seraphina, an understudy in life and in tragedy. For years she lived in the shadow of a more gifted relative, one who was exiled by scandal, while Colette remained behind. And when Seraphina disappeared into obscurity, Colette saw opportunity, not merely for vengeance, but for the transformation. Lestrade scowled. "So she impersonated Lydia Forsyth?" "Precisely," Holmes replied. "She donned the clothes, the voice, the presence of a woman long dead. She visited Fenwick, disguised, invoking Lydia's memory. She presented the ring either as a veiled threat or a test, and let him spiral into terror. And he did exactly what she hoped. He swallowed it, trying to bury the truth once more, but this time it killed him." Holmes resumed pacing, but Colette did not stop there. She planted forged evidence in the home of Callum Dreggs, creating a false trail. She fabricated notes, she staged performances, and when that began to unravel, she used Seraphina's reappearance as both a distraction and a mirror, letting the audience decide which of the two was truly the tragic heroine. Lestrade scratched his temple. "And Seraphina? How much did she know?" Holmes hesitated. "Enough, but not everything." "She was not guilty," I added, "but she allowed the illusion to flourish." Holmes nodded. She returned when Fenwick reached out, when he changed the will, perhaps trying to make peace. But by then, Colette had taken over the narrative. And Seraphina, so long forgotten, chose not to fight it. She simply stepped aside. Lestrade exhaled. And now both are gone. Yes, Holmes said, but only one has chosen exile. The other has chosen legacy. He turned to the inspector. Let the official report list Fenwick's death as accidental, choking, self-inflicted under duress. Let Colette's disappearance remain unofficial. But should she re-emerge as an artist, a patron, a rewritten name, then you may act. Lestrade shook his head. You're letting them walk. I'm letting the truth breathe, Holmes said. Sometimes, Inspector, the law is too narrow a pipe for all the waters of justice to flow through. He turned away. The matter closed in his mind. Later, after Lestrade had left, I asked Holmes a final question. Did you ever consider confronting Seraphina directly, demanding her full role in the affair? Holmes stood by the window, eyes on the smoke rising from the chimney pots. No, he said softly, because I realized something very early on. What was that? That this case was not about murder. It was about memory. He looked down at the quiet street below. Seraphina Vale did not want justice. She wanted to be remembered differently. And in that, she succeeded. The fire crackled, and I thought then of all the roles we play. Detectives, doctors, singers, understudies, and of how easily one can become the other when the stage is dark and the audience forgets the lines. Chapter 17. Outcome and Justice. Weeks that followed were marked by an odd calm, the sort that often settles after a great storm. London resumed its usual tempo, oblivious to the tangled tragedy that had passed through its theatres, courtrooms, and private drawing-rooms. The newspapers moved on, devoting their pages to a parliamentary scandal and a fire aboard a transatlantic steamer. Not a word more was printed about Aldous Fenwick, Seraphina Vale, or Colette's escape. And yet in our rooms at Baker Street, the shadows lingered. Holmes had packed the evidence away into a slim wooden box, anonymously labelled and shelved, between cases concerning a vanished Maharaja and the forgery of Dutch masterworks. He said nothing more of the matter, save for the occasional glance toward the glass-domed brooch or the burnt letter he never destroyed. I, however, found myself haunted, not by the unsolved, but by the unresolved. Do you believe justice has been done? I asked Holmes one morning as he clipped an article from the Times. He didn't look up. That depends on how one defines justice. I mean Colette. She manipulated, impersonated, provoked a man to his death. And now she walks free. Free? Holmes murmured. She walks in exile. Every city she enters will be temporary, every applause hollow. She is a performer without an audience, a ghost of her own making. He looked up then, eyes sharp. Justice does not always wear the robe of the magistrate. Sometimes it arrives as silence. Scotland Yard was less philosophical. Lestrade visited several times, each appearance more agitated than the last. She's vanished completely, he grumbled over tea one afternoon. We've wired Paris, Bordeaux, Marseille. Nothing. No aliases match. No new residencies. Not even a whisper. Holmes simply nodded. That tells you something, doesn't it? That she's clever. That she was prepared. Her exit was rehearsed like every other act in her life. Lestrade stood and paced. She'll make a mistake. Eventually, Holmes agreed, but not yet. Lestrade scowled, and when she does, Holmes shrugged. Then she'll be judged, perhaps by law, perhaps by time. He picked up his violin and turned his back to the room, leaving Lestrade fuming in silence. As spring yielded to summer, I received a letter by post. No return address. The handwriting was delicate, unmistakably feminine. Dear Dr. Watson, you once asked Holmes whether I knew what I was doing, whether I encouraged Colette, or merely allowed her to speak in my name. I offer you no defence, only this. I did not ask to be remembered, but I refuse to be erased. Somewhere in the world music is still played. That is enough. SVI read it twice, then folded it and placed it in the drawer beside my journal. I did not show it to Holmes, though I am certain he already knew it had arrived. That was her final word. As for the rest, the Forsyth estate was quietly divided into charitable trusts. The newly formed Lydia Foundation supported music scholarships for orphaned girls and funded restorations of small theatres across the south of England. No one publicly questioned the decision. Those who once whispered about scandal now spoke only of legacy. And Seraphina Vale, if that name still belonged to her, was last seen boarding a train to Avignon, in the company of a German cellist and a crate of original manuscripts. Colette Vale was not seen again, though a reviewer in Venice described a masked soprano who performed only once, then vanished before the curtain call. Her aria was titled The Swallowed Ring. Back in London, Holmes eventually returned to more tangible mysteries. A stolen Egyptian idol, a forged death certificate, the curious case of a botanist who vanished into his own hothouse. And yet, whenever I brought up Fenwick or the Vale women, Holmes grew quiet, not evasive, just reflective. One evening I found him standing at the window, watching the fog roll over Baker Street. He turned to me and said quite unexpectedly, "Watson, do you believe guilt is heavier than grief?" I considered this. "No, but I think guilt lingers longer." He nodded. "Yes, grief passes through us, but guilt remains, like a note held too long, until the silence beneath it is all that's left." And with that, he returned to his chair, lit his pipe, and opened a slim volume of poetry. For once, there was no case to prepare for, only the memory of one.